Greetings. So good to see all of you virtually. I'm John Terrell, Executive Director of Upper House and the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation. Welcome to our event hosted by Upper House and the Theology of Work Project. Upper House is a Christian study center located at the heart of the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus that seeks to explore the life of the mind and the questions of the soul. And our partner today, the Theology of Work Project, serves as a leading resource for biblical, theological, and pastoral material related to work, with its mission that every Christian be equipped and committed to work as God intends. A couple of housekeeping items for today. We will have an opportunity for Q&A after Al's presentation. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. You can vote questions up and down, which will help us sort through a lot of questions. Also, we have a large and very international crowd today, which is wonderful. So please be understanding if we don't get to all of your questions. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And we will also provide Al's email address at the end of this presentation, and Al will be glad to respond to you. Today, we have an opportunity to learn about ServiceMaster, one of the great companies of the 20th century that eventually grew to $6 billion in revenues and was rated the #1 service company in the world by Fortune magazine. Propelling ServiceMaster's financial and operational success was an unyielding commitment to faith-infused values that honored the dignity of all work and workers. In our current pandemic economy, the ServiceMaster story reminds us of the crucial role frontline service workers play in maintaining our healthcare system and other vital supply chains. But more broadly, their history offers fresh insight for strengthening our personal and organizational leadership. To gain insight, we now turn to someone who knows the history of ServiceMaster well. It is my great honor to introduce my friend, Dr. Al Ehresman, who will speak on his recent book, and I commend this book to you, The ServiceMaster Story, Navigating Tension Between People and Profit, published just this year by Hendrickson Publishers. Let me tell you a little bit about Al. Al spent 32 years at the Boeing Company, the final decade as the Director of Technology. More recently, he has served on the faculty of the School of Business, Government, and Economics at Seattle Pacific University. He's published a magazine on business ethics, which I commend to you. You can find it at ethix.org. And he's authored or co-authored numerous journal articles and books. In addition, he served on many boards, including the Theology of Work Project, and he's lectured on business, theology, mathematics, and technology on 6 continents. Al, at this time, we're going to bring you in, and I am just delighted to see you today.
Thank you, John. Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's great to have this conversation with you and to invite so many friends in. As we get started, Al, I know you've got some shared remarks and some slides, and you're going to tell us a little bit about ServiceMaster, but I would love to know, and I know our listeners would love to know, how you first got involved in this project. What drew you to the ServiceMaster story?
I was working with Bill Pollard, who I've known for about 20 years, and we were working on another project, and he called me one day and he said, I have another item for you. There needs to be a book on the history of the ServiceMaster Company, and you ought to write it. And I was deeply honored, deeply intimidated, and I said, no, I really can't do that. He sent me some material, though, to read. And 2 weeks later, when we talked, I said, Bill, you've stolen real estate in my brain. I am really interested in this story, and I will do it under 3 conditions. I don't want you to pay me because I want to make sure it's an unbiased story. I need to have access to your network, and I need to have final editorial control so that it really is an objective story. He graciously agreed to all of those. And I am deeply grateful to my friend Bill Pollard for allowing me to participate in this story. It has really been an exciting adventure.
Thanks, Al.
So,
we look forward to hearing some of your remarks, and then we'll be back for some time of Q&A.
thank you, John. And it truly is an honor to be here with you in Madison, even though it's virtual. You know, this time of COVID-19 is a reminder to us that we're not fully in control. It's a reminder to us that maybe during this pause, we can think about doing business in a different way. When I look back on business, I see leadership had become about the leader. Purpose had narrowed to making money. Values were hung on a wall, but they weren't really active in decision-making. And workers were treated as cogs in a money-making machine. I believe that ServiceMaster has some insight for us. And as we come out on the other side, I hope this will shape a new way of thinking about business. But if you happen to be here and you are not in business, I think this story will shape everything about any organization, be it education, medicine, the church, a nonprofit. I believe that there is some insight in this story that deals with these 4 themes of leadership, purpose, values, and the worker. So I encourage you to listen to this story with a very particular point of view. What can you walk away with as a means of doing differently? And in telling this story, I'm going to share some slides with you now. In telling this story, I would like to start with a story because I think this captures a bit about this company. Dave Aldridge had come to work for the ServiceMaster Company as an executive, but one of his early assignments was scrubbing baseboards in a new wing of a hospital. What kind of company would do that to an executive? Dave tells the story that while he was scrubbing these baseboards in this new wing, 2 nurses walked through and they looked at him. He looked at them. They didn't look at him. He looked at them and said, "Hello." They didn't say anything. Dave says, "I wanted to say, hey, I have an MBA. My wife is a nurse." But there was silence. Dave said that he learned something that day that shaped every bit of his leadership at the company. What he learned was it's really important to recognize that often service workers are treated as invisible. And he got to experience that, and it shaped his leadership. Secondly, he learned that the work of the service people was very difficult, and it shaped how he would lead that group of people. You see, that kind of practice at a service company is not usual, but it was very important in shaping leadership. In fact, the company did everything around 4 objectives, and I want to make sure that we get these. These were the values that the company held. They didn't just hang on a wall, they were deeply held. 4 things: to honor God in all we do, to help people develop, to pursue excellence, and to grow profitably. In the course of doing this work for this book, I interviewed more than 70 people that have been associated with ServiceMaster, and almost to a person, within 3 or 4 minutes of the conversation, they said, "By the way, do you know about our 4 values?" You know, they said, these not only shaped everything about our business, they shaped me as a person. The first 2 they regarded as end goals. These were the objectives of what the company was trying to do, to honor God in all we do and to help people develop. The second 2 were means goals. These were the ways in which they could do the first 2. They needed to be able to pursue excellence and grow profitably, to honor God and to help people develop. Now, a publicly traded company, an international company, it isn't common to have "to honor God in all we do" sitting up there as the headline. And yet They were able to communicate this to every person, regardless of their religious faith or non-faith, with 3 key points. Number 1, we want to have the highest standard of ethics in everything we do, not something we can rationalize, but something that goes against the gold standard. Secondly, we know from Scripture that all people are valuable, and therefore we want to treat every person with dignity and respect. And thirdly, God created work for us to do, and work is important and of great value, and the idea that to honor God means to value the worker, the work, and ethics. And then to help people develop, they had a goal for a period of time of saying, how can we get 20% of the people in our services business developed into a leadership program, allowing them to see and develop a career? This drove everything they did. In fact, they had a little device pictured here that showed the way they thought about this. Honoring God was the anchor. It's kind of like the fulcrum that sits below a teeter-totter. On top were developing people, pursuing excellence, and growing profitably. Now, think about it this way. Every business decision that came along, they would say, would this allow us to develop people? Can we do this with excellence? Can it develop? Can it grow profitably? These are the ways in which these values shaped everything they did. They weren't just hanging on a wall. They were a part of the fabric of the company. Ken Hansen, the second CEO, used this example. These objectives are often in tension. Should I help people develop, or should I make more money? Balancing objectives in tension, he said, is like stretching an exercise band. And when extended, you'd better not let go of either end, or it will hit you in the face. The point of his story was, this is not a trade-off between one and the other. It's using the tension to drive creativity to find a different way of approaching that problem. What was the ServiceMaster Company? Well, it was lots of stuff. Ultimately, through the 80s and 90s, after growing for many years, internally and organically, they began acquiring other brands. Why all these brands? The company looked at this as an opportunity to find other service companies that would benefit from their workers really being engaged in the work. You see, service industry had been characterized by 100 to 400% turnover every year. If you can create engaged workers that really care deeply about the work that they're doing, it will change the nature of their lives, and it will change the nature of the company. So they began acquiring these brands. Bill Pollard made this really important statement. When there is alignment between the cause of the firm and the cause of its people, move over, there will be extraordinary performance. You see, business today is characterized by many, many workers who are disengaged from what they do. They don't understand why this is important, and they don't care. And ServiceMaster had a different way of approaching this and seeking to gain this alignment. Now, it isn't just me saying this or company leaders. Jim Hess Scott at the Harvard Business School was the professor that dealt with the areas of service. He wrote 2 case studies on the ServiceMaster Company, and he made this comment. ServiceMaster has broken the cycle of failure in the service industry. They've re-engineered jobs, they've provided training, and they've delivered a level of self-esteem that many workers had never seen in the past. One of the ways that they did this, janitors in the hospital, for example, were brought into a conversation with doctors and nurses in the hospital. And they were told, your job is not just helping cleaning the floor, your job is helping the patient get well. Here's a connection between what you do and what the hospital does. And in creating this engagement, it really did change the nature of the company. In fact, the company had all sorts of recognition. One of the 20 most admired companies in the world in 1997 by the Financial Times. and top service company in the world by Fortune throughout the 80s and the 90s. And in this picture, Bill Pollard, the fourth of the CEOs, and Ken Wesner, the third, at this time in the 80s as chairman of the board, were featured in Fortune magazine. Now, it wasn't just about admiring and good company relations and good workers. The financial results were astounding. In 1962, when the company went public, you can't even see the number there, they were about $1 million company. And they grew dramatically over until through the year 2000 to about $6 billion. From 1970 until 1998, they grew in profitability every single year. And so as a result, this was a company that truly made a difference in the marketplace in every dimension. James Heskett again said the starting point for financial success was adherence to shared values. And while I believe this is true, I love the way Bill Pollard qualified this. He said, you should not expect or promote financial success or gain from seeking to honor God. I believe what he's saying is this: if you see that treating workers with dignity and respect will make them more productive and hence make your company more profitable, that won't work. You treat people, the workers, with dignity and respect because it's the right thing to do. You let the results take care of themselves and they follow. Peter Drucker was a frequent consultant for ServiceMaster Company. He talked to the board one day and he said, you know, you're not really in the services business. You're in the people development business. And the number of people that had gone through ServiceMaster and are now out doing other things in different parts of the world, it's astounding how they were shaped by their time at the ServiceMaster Company. So I've told you what the company is, but now let me tell you how they got here and what is it that they did. And to do that, I need to go back to 1929. And in 1929, those of you that recall your history will know that that was the time of the Great Depression. Marion Wade was the founder. Marion Wade was a very interesting person. In 1929, the company that he was selling for, he was selling moth control solutions. And he walked into the office one day and it was closed. They had gone out of business. He had an 8th grade education. He'd been hustling all of his life. And so as a result, he said, I can sell this stuff myself. And he started this company. Now he began to realize though, that the moth-proofing items that they had at the time weren't really very effective. In fact, one of the things he said was, the only way you can kill a moth with a mothball is hit them over the head with it, because they don't have a sense of smell. This stuff just didn't work. He found his way into a laboratory at Northwestern University and actually invented a new moth-proofing system that involved heating some chemicals. He created this, he patented it, and it became a part of what the company did. He later found his way into another laboratory and invented a way to clean carpets that are in place. You see, at that time, most carpets were sent out for cleaning, and he found a way of doing it at home. He was an inventor. But he had worked in every job all of his life, and he came to value the work and the worker, and he built a very powerful ethical culture that was rooted in his faith. But Marion Wade had a Damascus Road experience. In 1944, he was cleaning a closet in Evanston, Illinois, and the chemicals that he had heated blew up in his face. He was blinded. They thought that he would be blinded for life. As he lay there in the hospital, he said, I was already a Christian. So I figured this accident was God's way of getting through to me in some point, and he'd eventually let me know. Marion thought about the idea of maybe being a missionary or going off as a pastor, doing something different. But what came to him there was the idea to look at business in a different way. He said, I'd been personally trying to honor God, but I never tried this with my company. I had been trained in the school of competition that attests that religion and business can't mix. 1944 then was a time when he was greatly re-energized around his business. He ultimately did get his sight back after months in the hospital. But when he came back, he said, how can I accelerate my business? And he went out recruiting, and he found a man named Ken Hansen. And in 1946, Ken Hansen joined the company. Now, Ken Hansen had all the qualifications for a business executive. He had been trained in theology and in philosophy at Wheaton College. He had been an interim pastor, but Marion Wade saw something in Ken, an entrepreneurial spirit, something that he said, this man would really be key to our business. Ken Hansen came in, and shortly after he arrived, he incorporated the company and he named the company. Neither of these had ever happened under Marion Wade. He named the company Wade, Wenger, and Associates. And someone said to him, well, where's your name? I mean, you're the key guy. And he said, it's there. It's in and Associates. It characterizes something about a level of humility and leadership that is really important. Ken Hansen took this company, the Chicago-based company of a small number of people, and began expansion. And the first national expansion was to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and ultimately to England and across the country. In 1962, he took the company public, and realizing that he needed more capability and tools for his leadership, he went back on weekends and got an executive MBA from the University of Chicago in 1964. One of the really fun things that he did is he realized that as he was traveling to these different places, how did he keep track of the business? So he developed a way that he could call into the various locations, get a few numbers, sit down with his slide rule, and create what I think is the first business dashboard drawing on this kind of information. Ken was deeply committed to his Christian faith and to the business, and he continued and developed further this ethical and Christian base. Together, these people, these two, Marion Wade and Ken Hansen, went out and recruited a man named Ken Wesner in 1953. He joined the company. Ken was trained more technically than the other two, and he began developing business processes. He developed a way of training. He developed a research division built off of what Marion Wade did. It's very unusual for a research division in a services company, but they explored chemicals, they explored processes. He began some major expansion, and he is the one who finally brought together these four objectives that they had been operating from over time. One day a nun had come to Marion Wade and said, maybe you ought to bring your business to hospitals and do the cleaning services at hospitals. Marion and Ken Hansen asked Ken Wesner to develop this business, and that's what he did. And within a number of years, this became a large percentage of what ServiceMaster did, dealing with housekeeping, maintenance, support in hospitals all over the country and all over the world. Ken Wesner was himself deeply committed to his Christian faith and applied this in every step of their processes. He used to say, we need to help a person be before we can help that person do. You see, this was their commitment to the worker that was not just how do I manipulate them, but how do I help them become the person that God intended them to become. As time went on, Ken Wesner and Ken Hansen, Marion Wade died in 1973, Ken Wesner and Ken Hansen went out and recruited Bill Pollard. Bill Pollard came to the company in 1977. He had been a lawyer by training. He had run his own law firm. He had been a vice president at Wheaton College, and they recruited him to come into the company and provide future leadership. Now, I need to tell you something about Bill's hiring. You see, Bill was told that he could eventually be the CEO, And in the course of the interview, he began to pursue with the two Kens, Ken Hansen and Ken Wesner, what would it take to become CEO of this company? How long will it take and what would I need to do? And Ken Hansen stood up after about 5 minutes and he said, the interview's over, and he took Bill to the door. That evening he called Bill and he said, you want to know what happened in there? Let's meet for breakfast. And over breakfast, Ken Hansen said, we are really interested in you if you want to come to ServiceMaster to serve. But if you want to come for a title, we're not interested. Bill said that shaped his thinking about leadership forever. And the idea that it's not about a title, but it's about serving. He took over in 1977 in September. And his first 8 weeks, he was scrubbing floors at a hospital to get a flavor of what it is to be in the service business. When Bill became the CEO in 1983, the Medicare had made some changes in the way they reimbursed hospitals. And the problem was that it looked like outsourcing was not going to work for many hospitals. As a result, the market said about ServiceMaster, you guys are in deep trouble. Their stock dropped from 37 to 17, not from past performance, but from future expectations. Bill relentlessly looked at new ways of expanding and growing the business. And when you looked at the growth in revenue and profit, you couldn't see the way the company had started in 1983. He expanded the business, and then he went out to begin acquiring other brands. And in doing this acquisition, he became the relentless teacher. Because you see, if a company is developed in one way and they're brought into this new environment, it's very difficult for them to kind of change course. And so as a result, teaching and helping these new companies understand the philosophy, and Bill became known as the professor. Major revenue and growth and profit growth occurred during this time, and Bill relentlessly taught the ethical and Christian foundation. In fact, in 1978, Ken Wesner took Bill to Wall Street and had Bill explain the 4 objectives. And Bill always said, I love the idea of confronting people with the question of God. One of the acquisitions was the Terminex company, and the leader was Carlos Cantu. And in 1994, Carlos Cantu took over the leadership of the company. He continued the development and integration of brands and the acquisitions. He continued the ethical and Christian base of the company. Unfortunately, in 1997, Carlos was diagnosed with cancer. He tried to continue and did for a period of time, but his time was shortened by illness. And in 1999, it became apparent that he could not continue. And so as a result, he had to step aside. And Bill took back over for about 16 months. Let's talk about a couple of the principles and practices that they followed during this time. Here's Bill's view of profit, and contrast this with the way the market usually thinks about profit. Profit is a means in God's world to be used and invested, not an end to be worshiped. That's reflected in the 4 objectives. It's an essential source of capital. Success. Marion Wade says success in this company is not about personal success or even corporate success. That's not what Christianity is about. Whatever God wants is what I want. But he made this commitment. I did try to build a business that would live longer than I would in the marketplace, and that would witness to Jesus Christ in the way business is conducted. Bill would talk about leadership, and he would say, my leadership responsibility was not about me or my feelings. It was about what should be done for our business and our people. This is the essence of servant leadership. And he would often remind his leadership team, there is an awesome responsibility in leadership. You see, too often people approach leadership in terms of the perks they can get, in terms of the status, the power, but leadership is an awesome responsibility. Let me just talk about some of the practices. I won't go through all of these in detail, but I'd like you to be aware that while every practice they did could be explained in very natural ways, the fact is every one was rooted deeply in Scripture. So this identification with the workers, the idea of a leader becoming a servant, a leader working in the work of their people. Remember Jesus, when he came into the world, it says he came into the world and lived for a while among us. I think this idea of identification drew deeply from that position and had an amazing effect on the workers. Servant leadership, Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 20, treating people with dignity and respect, drew on Genesis chapter 1, where every person is made in the image of God. The dignity of all work. In Genesis chapter 2, we see that work was before the fall, and even after the fall, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart is working for the Lord. And so the dignity of work is deeply rooted in Scripture. Running a public company with the goal of honoring God, Jesus said, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." And then training, teaching people how to do something, having them support you, then having them do the work, but providing some feedback, and then having them teach was the 4-part step training that Ken Wesner developed. And in the course of this, you see Jesus teaching the disciples, having them support him when he fed the 5,000, sending them out 2 by 2 and reviewing their work, and then having the disciples teach and train others. And finally, and maybe this is the most unique and important thing, Ken Hansen used to say that if you have a system that works perfectly with perfect people, it will fail because there are no perfect people. Learning from mistakes was fundamental to what they did. In Ephesians chapter 4, it talks about forgiveness and the value of and importance of forgiveness, and this characterized the leadership of ServiceMaster throughout its years. Marion Wade used to say, if you don't live it, you don't believe it. And the idea of this really was a process and deeply impactful for all of the leadership at the company. Shirley was a worker in one of the hospitals, and one of the things that she said, the question is, does this penetrate all the way to the worker? I loved what she said. She said, if I wasn't working here, the hospital wouldn't function, the patients wouldn't get well, the doctors wouldn't serve. In fact, this hospital wouldn't exist without housekeeping. You talk about ownership in the work that they do. Yes, it really did make a difference. So over a period from 1929 till 2000, this company had incredible Christian leadership, each one building on the work of the other and making an incredible difference in the marketplace and in the lives of people and in the lives of the customers. James Heskett again said, the ServiceMaster story is an important story of large-scale servant leadership that proves that making money and changing the lives of people for the better are more than compatible. They're inextricably linked. This is the story through 2000. Now, what happened after 2000? Because everyone kind of wonders, how did this carry on? So here's the rest of the story. In 2001, when Carlos had died and the board was looking for someone, they ended up bringing in a man who bought into the principles, at least in statement, Jonathan Ward. But it became pretty clear that this was not quite as deeply owned, and the company began to change direction. They went private in 2006, purchased by a private equity firm, and 3 different CEOs led them during that time. Rob Gillette came along in 2013 and took them public again. I talked extensively with Rob, and he made this statement. He was the first of these leaders to reach back and say, Bill, there was some magic that was happening before. What was it? What should we be doing? And when Rob heard about this idea of servant leadership and valuing the worker, he said it was really hard to deal with the culture at the time because it wasn't really the soil to allow this to happen. He was terminated for profit not growing rapidly enough in 2017. Nick Alvarti took over in 2017. He was terminated in January of this year. And when the new leader came in, he made this interesting statement. I wonder why we have all these brands. In 2001, one of the quotes that I found from someone in the capital management area was that John Ward made it clear his first principle is to increase shareholder value. One writer that I found was excited about John Ward coming in because he said, finally, there's some modern management instead of these Christian leaders. He said, you know, John Ward implemented Six Sigma rather than looking to biblical principles as Marion Wade would have done. I think Louis Solomon didn't really understand what had been going on because he didn't understand about the kind of inventions they had, the innovative management they had, the incredible growth that they had. But you know, later when he wrote the preface to this book, he made this interesting observation. Coincidentally with this transition, the company's legal difficulties mounted and its financial results stagnated. This is a telling picture of the fact that this change really did make a difference, but not in the way it was intended to make a difference. In 2020, if you go out to the ServiceMaster website today, you will see this statement. ServiceMaster operates under many of the same tenets of Marion Wade's original purpose: to deliver exceptional service and quality to customers. And if you've listened carefully to what I've said, you would say, wait a minute, where is to honor God in all we do? Where is to help workers develop? It's nowhere here. And I think that's the difference. If you look at the financials of the company, the $6 billion company in 2000, it's about a $2 billion company today. Profit has been up and down, and it's another company. It's a service company, but it isn't the same as the foundation. And you see, between 2000 and 2020, there was just one key change: from honoring God and helping workers develop to the singular pursuit of profit. This difference makes a difference. And I hope that you can see that the big lesson that we can learn from all of this is values are important. Those 4 values that ServiceMaster held for years are gone. Purpose, helping workers develop, is a little different than driving shareholder value. Workers, that's a little different when they become cogs in a money-making machine rather than people who you want to grow as people. And leadership, is it all about the leader or is it about the servant? I think that there are some things that any leader can learn from this. Whether you're in a business or not in a business, I would urge you to think about clarity of vision and purpose. It's one thing to have a clear statement of direction and then a clear set of values, but often these are on the floor, on the shelf, on the wall. In fact, I've been in companies where the value statement of the company is the butt of jokes because people are our most important resource. Not really. So clarity of purpose, clarity of objectives, but living them out. The role of servant leadership, the support and development of workers. You know, we've learned a new term during COVID-19. It's called essential workers. And I'm wondering, are we going to be able to continue with essential workers post-COVID-19? I don't think this will just happen. And I'd love to see a movement, the commitment of new kinds of leadership that will carry on the value of essential workers, the practices, making those values real. You see, what this company did is not just talk about these values on big business decisions. They penetrated every corner of the business, hiring, training, development, firing, dealing with competitors, talking about faith. In every case, they were talking about how do we make these real. Now, you might think firing is a strange one. One executive I interviewed said one of the first questions he asked when he was interviewed was, how would you fire someone? And he said, I didn't think ServiceMaster fired people. I thought it was all about the warm fuzzies. And he said, no, this is a business. But how do you treat a person with dignity and respect, even when they don't fit with the company? So these practices had to penetrate very deeply. They were deeply rooted in the leader's Christian faith, but they were not imposed on others. Because you see, the role of Christian faith in this company was not about proselytizing, but it was a foundation for these practices and priorities. One Muslim leader that I talked with told me that his life was forever changed by being a part of this company. He didn't feel oppressed, but he said it opened up his question on the question of God. And I do believe that that was one thing that ServiceMaster was able to do with that objective. They adapted the practices over time as the culture changed, as they went internationally. And I think that's an important thing for any business to do. And finally, if you're a worker, you might say, I'd like to work in a company like that, but you don't know where I work. And I would say everyone has the opportunity to think about the bigger purpose of your work. It's great if your leadership helps you in that, but can you think about the bigger purpose of your work right where you are? If you remember that every person is an image bearer of God, worthy of being treated with dignity and respect, and that includes the boss. So this applies not only to a person in leadership, but every person. And then we're reminded by Paul in the Colossians, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. There are some questions I'd like you to be thinking about as you apply this to your own work. Can you see your work in this way right now? Not waiting for the ideal job, maybe not with supportive management, maybe not even in a place you would rather be. Don't wait for the ideal assignment to say, well, then I can put this into practice. How can you do it right now? And if you're in a leadership role, can you provide this kind of supportive environment for your own people? Can you lead in this way? I believe this is possible and can make an incredible difference. You see, being a Christian in business is not adding a prayer to business as usual. As fundamentally important as prayer is, and as important as prayer wound its way through this entire story, but it's about thinking about everything in light of the kingdom of God. The book is called The ServiceMaster Story, Navigating Tension Between People and Profit. It was a lot of fun to work on. Thank you, Bill, for the opportunity to do this, and I hope it's helpful to all of you. Thank you very much.
Al, wonderful, Al. Thank you so much. The questions are starting to really come in here, and so I'm going to do my best to get to as many questions as I can. We have about 15 minutes before, a little less than 15 minutes before we need to break. Fred asks, how successful was the company in implementing the 4 values in their acquired companies?
You know, I think a really good, I'll take 2 cases. 1986, they brought in 2 companies. One was Terminex and one was Marion Wade. Marion Wade was a company that actually had some very similar values in Christian leadership, and that was pretty straightforward. Terminex was slower, I think, in my observation. Although one of the things that happened in the original negotiation, Carlos Cantu said this, and I found his quote, He said, Bill asked me in the midst of the negotiation to come and discuss a few more things about this. And he said, I was prepared to go one level deeper in all the financials. And he said, when Bill presented me with this way of doing business, he said, I was kind of blown away at first. And then I was excited about being a part of this. And he said, it reshaped me as I thought about this. But then one of the leaders I talked to at Terminex said, you know, that first year, we would come back from a meeting and we would say, what's all this philosophy stuff? We need to get on with making money. But slowly over time, they realized the importance, and it was life-changing for them. I think some of the later acquisitions, this didn't as fully happen, and that may have been part of the reason why it was slower at the end. And I think it takes time to do this. It's a very hard problem, but I think they did it well with the companies that have been involved for a long time.
Great, thank you. This is an anonymous attendee. It's a really creative question. What is the most memorable or surprising historical source you found that really showed the character of ServiceMaster?
There was a man who was from Saudi Arabia, and he came to ServiceMaster to explore the idea of opening ServiceMaster Saudi Arabia. Hassan Maharik is his name. He told me that when he first came, he couldn't believe what was going on. He couldn't believe the kind of instruction. He couldn't believe that he met Bill Pollard, the CEO of the company. He told me about the first training session, and they had all these butcher papers on the wall. And at the end of the day, they were getting ready to throw them away. And he said, I need to take those with me. Those are the most valuable thing I've ever seen. And then he told me that more recently, he now runs 3 companies in Saudi Arabia. And he said, guess what? We have 4 objectives: to honor God in all we do, to help people develop, to pursue excellence, and to grow profitably. And he was so enthusiastic. And from a different culture, from a different way, it connected with the heart of a human being.
Yeah, good. Tom asks, who was on the board when they selected Jonathan Ward in 2000? It seems like this was a pivot point when the values of the company shifted. Was it a moment of significant mission drift?
Yeah, I think that the struggles that the company had had as Carlos got ill during the late 90s and the environment of 2001, remember that was when the dot-com thing kind of exploded and there was a recession in the country. And I also believe that John, I don't know how to read the heart of a person, but I think that he had an intent of doing this and looked like the person who could provide the leadership. So I think the intent was right, but I just think it takes some level of deep ownership, just like we talked about before, when it takes a while for a culture to take over. I think John just did not get it. And I think maybe the decision, it's easy to second guess someone's decision. I think maybe the decision not to make a change when it looked like it wasn't working out might have been a tough one. But to second guess the decision itself, I'm not sure I could do that.
I have a question here about unions, and I don't know if ServiceMaster worked with unions or not, but if they did, what were some lessons about working with unions, and particularly when there was a contentious or negative relational aspect?
Yeah, so ServiceMaster had an unusual way of working, for example, in hospitals where the janitors remained on the payroll of the hospital, but it was the leadership that kind of instructed and developed these people. So exactly, I can't really answer the question about unions itself. I can answer the question, though, about how the lives of the individuals were changed. Bill told this story about visiting in London to one of the hospitals where he worked. And after the business meetings, he said, I want to meet the people that are doing the work. So he goes down on the floor and he's introduced to these people and as the chairman of ServiceMaster. And this woman dropped her broom, came up and put her arms around Bill, and she says, thank you, you changed my life. Before, I was a janitor. Now I've learned how to do things right. I've learned why I do things, and I just love the changes. So I think that kind of thing penetrated pretty deeply, but I don't know fully what role unions may have played in some areas.
Okay. This is a question from Rebecca. In light of Mr. Pollard's comment that we are not to be motivated by financial success, but by pleasing God, did he ever speak on how he kept those motivations in check?
Yeah, you know, he spoke a lot in The Awesome Responsibility of Leadership. He spoke a lot about profit. He actually gave many talks on this topic, which are deep and rich. So I tried to capture some of that in the book. Several people told me about a time when it seemed like there was a push toward profit because everyone is imperfect. And Bill told about being called by someone in his organization and the realization that, yes, I had gone off in this way, and the accountability that leaders put themselves under, that was really the key check. And so I think the idea of servant leadership, which opens you up to being accountable to others, no, the leaders were not perfect. And I could give you examples from every one of them, but keeping this in check was because of servant leadership.
Great. This next question comes from Howard. Can you tell us about a time prior to 2000 when the leader's faith to do the right thing, glorify God, was greatly challenged? A moment of challenge where their faith was really tested.
Yeah, I mean, I can point to several. One of them was in 1983 when Bill just took over. I mentioned the market was in difficult position. His major customer was in difficult position. And the idea that it would be easy to say, maybe I need to give up on these practices and do something different. And he didn't. Ken Wesner told a story about working with a hospital that obviously was abusive to its people, and about the idea that even though this was an important account, they ended up firing their customer because they said this would violate what we stand for as a company, and we do not want to be associated with it. So there are some hard choices that were made throughout the history. Those are big things, but then in little things too. You know, how do you listen to this person and when you're really busy? Someone told me the story when they were going through a major acquisition, and Ken Hansen had retired, was living in California. He was still on the board, and right at the last minute, he called Bill and said, I wonder if you ought to do this. And this person that listened in on the conversation said, Bill didn't have to take that call. He had a lot on his plate, and yet he paused, took the call, spent an hour talking it through, and felt that he was the better for it. So, you know, I think there's a lot of big and little ways in which this happened.
Yeah, good. Another question. What were the effects from moving ServiceMaster private, public, private, you know, it went back and forth. What kind of impact did that have? Well,
I think in the 2000s phase, by going private, I think that they were, it took them completely away then from the hold that the 4 objectives and the banner of ServiceMaster had before. And when they reemerged, they were really quite different. So I think that was an impact. I kind of skipped over another part where they didn't go private, but they became a limited partnership from 86 to 96. and how they tried to remain open to the market and at the same time be able to make some decisions for the long term. That's an interesting story all by itself, and I didn't have time to tell that part of the story.
Good. Another question more about leadership. The leaders at ServiceMaster regularly describe themselves as shingles on a roof. What did they mean, and what role did this value play in creating and sustaining their culture?
Yeah, shingles on a roof actually came from something that Marion Wade found in a book on a silver company, but it demonstrates a level of humility, because shingles on a roof says, as one leader takes over, the other leader doesn't disappear, but they kind of hang around on the board and involved in the company. Sometimes I've observed that when a leader takes over in a company, they want to have nothing to do with the prior leadership because they want to make it their company. That was the opposite of what they did. And so Ken Hansen would say, Marion Wade is better at talking to a customer than I am. And he would bring Marion Wade in to dazzle the customer, and he would close the sale. Bill Pollard would bring back in Ken Hansen and Ken Wesner. They would engage in the conversation, and they just worked collaboratively in a way that I've never seen leaders work before. It was magic for them and really important.
That's great. We'll end with this last question, Al. Based on your understanding of ServiceMaster, but also your own corporate experiences and teaching in a business school, what lessons can we learn from ServiceMaster to strengthen business education?
The headline for that one is often business schools teach the principle that a purpose of business is all about maximizing profit. And I think that penetrates so much of the thinking today. I think that really does need to change. One colleague at Fordham University said after he read this book, this ought to be required reading for every business school, because it changes not only the purpose of profit, but the role of essential workers, the role of servant leadership, and all of these principles, which really get glossed over when you think about maximizing profit and driving toward gain. So I think business schools could play a big part in this. Sadly, I don't think they do in general today. SPU did, but I think a lot of the business schools do not.